Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Carolina Kübler-Tetzel, and I lead the TILE network here at the School of Psychology and Neuroscience. Happy to have you all here, and I'm very excited about today's talk on generating internal feedback from self and peer review. Our speakers will be Maxine Swingler, David Nicol, and Lorna Morrow, and I will let them introduce themselves. If you have any questions or comments during the talk, feel free to just pop in your question and comments in the chat. And we will be picking up any questions throughout the talk and definitely at the end. So I will hand over to Dr. Maxine Swingler for a start, I guess. Yes.
Okay, hi everyone. I hope you can see my screen and you can hear me. If not, just let me know in the chat. My name is Maxine Swingler, and together with Lorna Morrow and David Nicol, we're going to be talking about some work on peer review and self-review that we did in the University of Glasgow. We're really keen to hear all your questions. If you can post them in the chat, if you're thinking of questions as we're going along, that's fantastic. And then if we haven't got to them in the session within the chat, then we'll have time at the end to discuss them. So, as many of us know, feedback can be a troublesome issue in higher education. It takes up a lot of our time as teachers, but also in terms of things like the NSS National Student Survey shows that students are generally less positive about their assessment and feedback than other aspects of their programmes and their courses. And research has shown that students also experience a number of barriers that can prevent them from really effectively engaging and using the feedback that they are provided with. In more recent years, in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a change in feedback delivery being seen as a transmission, so transmitting a product from us as teachers to the students, and much more about a two-way interactive process where you're in dialogue with the students, and it's a cyclical process, also called the recipients, where students have to be active recipients in order to learn and to develop what's called feedback literacy as a skill. And they also have to engage it, but we also can design our curriculum and our learning activities to encourage this feedback literacy and dialogue. So while that approach can tackle the issue of feedback delivery through dialogue and so on, engaging the students, feedback is still viewed as something that's externally produced, that usually by us as teachers. But actually, feedback is being generated all the time by students, by all of us, when we evaluate ourselves or our work in relation to others or other pieces of work. So we're doing this all the time. When we evaluate our work against when we've seen our peers' work, not only when we've seen our markers' work, we may be evaluating ourselves in terms of what the teacher we think the teacher wants, and also students are evaluating their work in relation to more long-term goals like maybe a career and what they think is important. So I guess the key question here is, how can we improve this inner feedback generation, this feedback that's being generated all the time by students, without increasing our workload, without us having to give more and more feedback to the students. I'm just going to move this right there. So in terms of helping us to answer this question, we can look to various practices that have gone on in higher education over the years, and peer review is one that's really useful. So peer review is not peer assessment, the students aren't grading each other, but where they're giving and receiving feedback on each other's work. And there's been a lot of research more recently about peer review saying that actually the review process itself and generating feedback for other students can be equally useful as receiving feedback from peers, or even more useful. So there seems to be a benefit in this reviewing process and producing feedback over and above just receiving more feedback. And then more recently, David and colleagues have found that actually when students review other students' work, they spontaneously start to reflect back and compare it with their own work and generate what we call inner feedback. So it could be about the disciplinary content, it could be the approach or the quality or so on. So it seems then that there's two benefits to reviewing and peer review. So students are learning to make evaluative judgments of others' work, but at the same time, they're activating inner feedback on their own work. They're comparing it against their own work and getting different perspectives. And we're going to call, for the purposes of this talk, we're going to call that self-review. So that activating that inner feedback through reviewing other pieces of work. So the first question that we wanted to look at was, okay, we want to try and generate this self-review, but what type of instructions do we want to give to students to make that explicit? So what types of comparison are useful for students to make? So there's been quite a bit of research on using rubrics and students comparing their own work against the rubric. By rubric, I mean an assessment criteria, specific points that need to be covered in an assessment. And it's been found that rubrics can be effective in getting students to evaluate their own work, but also more recent work has shown that actually when students are given a rubric or whether they're not given a rubric and they're asked to evaluate each other's work, they will often come up with the same sorts of points and actually sometimes more elaborate points when they're not given a rubric. And then the other aspect is more recent work, and again, David has done with some colleagues, is that when students compare their work with other students' work and they explicitly ask to look at what's different between mine and this other person's work, they can often come up with similar comments to that the teacher would give on the same piece of work. And also they can be more elaborate than the initial teacher's comments. So we wanted to investigate how the instructions that we give to students would impact the types of comments they would be making, these self-review comments, what they would be making about their own work. So the other aspect of the study was more about the students' perception of this whole process. So we're analysing what they were doing in terms of the comments, but we wanted to know what they thought about it afterwards. So the second two questions were, how did different components of peer review, so the review process itself, this kind of self-review, inner feedback, and then receiving the peer feedback, how do these all contribute to students' perceived learning? And then finally, there have been issues, and particularly with peer review, that the quality of the work that students are given to review will vary. Quite often peer review is done anonymously, you're randomly assigned two pieces of work, you don't know whether they're high or low quality. So we were interested in how the quality of the work might contribute to how students perceive their learning, but also we wanted to find out if the quality of the work we review impact their self-review comments as well. So that's why that bit's in green. So for those second two questions on students' perception about the process, we used a questionnaire on student perceptions, and Lorna's going to talk you through the results of that one. So this is a bit of a scary diagram, so I'll try and talk you through this as much as I can. So this was all done in the context of a third-year honours psychology course, and in this course the students had to design and collect data for a qualitative research project. So they had to run a focus group and analyse the data and write it up as a research report. What we did is ask the students as a formative activity to produce an analysis of just one theme in terms of their transcript, and then note a few discussion points in relation to how their results referred to previous research or how they related to previous research. And we did this for two different cohorts. So we did this for a cohort in 2017-18, and we did it in a cohort for 2019-20. So each cohort did the same thing, and we're comparing two different cohorts. So each of the cohorts had to review three reports, two of them which were written by peers, and one was an exemplar. This was one that I had written in collaboration with colleagues, and then the students reviewed it. So in the first cohort, as you can see here, they did their peer review And then immediately after peer review 1, that was followed by the self-review questions. And in this condition, the students were asked to use the initial assessment criteria they used for their peer reviews to review their own work. So the questions for those are below. So it was quite direct questions about, are the themes identified, supported by quotes and so on? How does it inform existing research? So they were very closely tied to the initial peer review criteria. And they did this after each of the peer reviews and then after the exemplar condition. In cohort 2, again, the students did the peer reviews in the same way as in cohort 1, followed them with self-reviews. The exemplar that we used was the same, but the difference here was that they were asked to compare their work directly with the work that they just reviewed. So peer review 1 and self-review 1, they'll be looking at that peer review 1's work. And they were asked to answer specific questions. What are the key differences? What did you learn? And were there any specific improvements you could make to your work? So just to give you a bit of detail about the participants in this part of the study in the comments analysis. So they were third year psychology honours students, and each cohort, we've got the numbers there. In terms of engagement with the peer review activity, it was quite high for both groups. They also reviewed other students' work. The reviews of the exemplars were slightly lower, less engaged with that, but still not too bad. And then we took a sample of each of these cohorts and analysed their comments. So we used Europa, which allows us to download and analyse the comments, and for all of that to be done fairly anonymously. We did look at grades though, of the students that were in the sample, and made sure that the grade distribution was similar and the average grade was similar for each cohort. However, for each course, the overall grades did differ slightly. They were in the B category, but one was higher than the other. So looking at how we coded the self-review comments. So remember, we're thinking about these two cohorts. One have been asked to use a rubric for self-review, the other one comparators. So how do we code the comments or make sense of them? So we used a basis of Hattie and Timperley's framework. And Hattie and Timperley's framework is for teacher feedback comments generally, and it's quite well established, quite well known. And we took two aspects of that. We took one part which they call task and which we call content here. So it's where comments or feedback comments are directly about the content, the strengths, the weaknesses, errors related to that particular task that the students have been asked to do. Another aspect or category of feedback is process. So this is slightly higher level, it's more holistic. It's comments about the quality of the analysis, the writing, and also relational aspects, how perhaps students are looking at relationships between the structure and the evaluation and so on. So going beyond just commenting on one part of the work that was quite specific to the task. And you can see some examples in the table there. The other thing we did was checked whether how elaborate they were. So some comments, students took a lot of time and wrote quite detailed comments, others were more brief. So we had content elaboration, content little or no elaboration, and then the same for process elaboration or little or no elaboration. So before I talk you through the results here, to explain this graph. So the blue and the purple bars relate to cohort 1, and cohort 1 blue, a student review, means that these were the comments that were generated after the peer reviews, after they looked at other students' work and then evaluated their own according to the rubric. The exemplar review is when the students evaluated the exemplar and then evaluated their own work in relation to that. And these are the comments for that. So red and green are cohort 2. So these were the comparative conditions where they were comparing between their work and other students directly. And again, we had that for peer review, after peer review, and then after the exemplar review. And then along the bottom here, we've got the elaboration, non-elaboration for content, and then the same for process, and we're looking at across the y-axis the percentage of coded comments for each of those. So you can see for content and elaboration, all levels are fairly low, slightly higher in the first cohort, the rubric cohort, than the other cohort. When you look at content with little or no elaboration, so this is brief comments about the content of their own work, then you can see this is far higher for cohort 1, so both for the students review and the exemplar review. When we looked at the process comments, we see a slightly different pattern. So again, this time it's cohort 2 that are higher in the process and elaboration comments, and they're also higher in the process little or no elaboration. I've done some very preliminary analysis on this, and using a chi-square where I've looked at overall content, whether it's elaborate or not, and overall process for cohort 1 student review, cohort 2 student review, there's a significant difference. So there's significantly more content comments for cohort 1 than there are for cohort 2. And then the same result when you compare cohort 1 exemplar review and cohort 2 exemplar review. So there seems to be some substantial differences in the student comments. I haven't really analysed any of the elaboration aspects yet. You can see there's a slight difference between the exemplars and the students in the amount of elaboration, but those differences are fairly small, so we wouldn't want to come to any conclusions based on that until I've done more analysis. So I'm going to hand over to Lorna now, who is going to talk about the questionnaire.
Just very quickly, there was one question in the chat, Maxine, asking about whether all students were allowed to participate in the peer reviewing part, or only those students who had submitted work before to that activity. I know that Europa allows for both, but what did you use for that for your specific course?
So I'm pretty sure I'd set it to you could only review and receive reviews if you submitted something and you participated in reviews. So there's a setting on Europa. So basically to stop people submitting something and getting peer feedback without doing the reviews process themselves. So in order to receive the peer feedback, they have to do the review and they have to submit their work. But it was open to everyone who did that. And there was fairly high engagement in that part. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, that was.
One point just for me to emphasize, Maxine, is that we're only looking at the data, the self-review aspect of this. That's the only data we're looking at, is what do they generate for themselves when they're either comparing their work against a rubric or they're comparing their work against exemplars. That's the important data in this. But that was a good, just to clarify the focus.
Thank you.
Okay, over to me. Can you hear me fine, hopefully, and see my slides? Yeah, great. Excellent, thank you. Yeah, so hi, as David said there, the difference again between the cohorts, just a quick summary. So for cohort 1, we're thinking about students comparing their own paper to the rubric, and for cohort 2, we're comparing their own papers to the papers of their peers. That's the important distinction between the cohorts here. So I'm going to talk about the questionnaires very briefly, about the difference between the questionnaires, and then I'll start going through all the data from the questionnaires. So we managed to obtain 28 participants who filled out a lengthy survey from cohort 1, and from cohort 2 we got 37 participants. So these were essentially any of the students who participated in the course. So that was level 3 students and a few level 4s and some master's students as well. The data that I'm going to talk about was from all of those students. And the questionnaire was really an iterative process. It wasn't the case that we took the same questionnaire and ran it twice across both cohorts. Instead, there were some things that we were interested in for the first questionnaire. When we got some answers to that, there were some other things that we wanted to follow up on for the second questionnaire. So the focus on the questionnaires is a bit different, but hopefully you'll see that they're complementary. But so it's not the case, I'm not going to make comparisons between the data and the questionnaires because the questions are different. Instead, I'm going to talk about, I guess, the story in general and what we can ascertain from what people said. So for the first questionnaire, what we were particularly interested in relation to the second research question was which peer review processes contribute to people's learning. So we were interested in people's experiences and perceptions of the benefits of each of the aspects of the overall peer review process. And so we really wanted to quantify what it was about the peer review process that contributed to their learning. And for the second questionnaire, as I said, we got some interesting results from that about the different aspects of the peer review process that were helpful. So for the second questionnaire, then we were interested in what was it that was actually learned. Here we've learned about where they're learning it, and now we wanted to try to find out what it was that they were actually learning. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so I'm now going to attempt to take you through, I think, 8 or 9 or so different graphs of data. So first of all, the first few graphs relate to this second research question. So how do the different components of peer review contribute to students' perceived learning? So we broke down the peer review process into these different aspects. So for reviewing, we're thinking about students actually reading other people's work and writing down some comments on that. Secondly, self-reviewing after reviewing. So they have read someone else's paper and given comments, and now they're thinking about their own paper. But for this cohort 1, they're thinking about their own paper in relation to the rubric, the assessment criteria. Thirdly, receiving reviews. So other students have written reviews about their work and they're reading through those. And finally, self-reviewing after receiving feedback. So after receiving the reviews, they're asked to write down their own comments on their own work in light of the feedback from peers. So the rating scale that we use for this, so the blue corresponds to students feeling that they learned little or nothing from that particular aspect. Purple corresponds to students feeling like they definitely learned something, and pink corresponds to students perceiving that they learned a great deal. And so here on the y-axis, that's the percentage of people that indicated each of these different answers. So we've got some pretty graphs here. Just looking at that, it looks like reviewing and receiving reviews are the most helpful, but we also carried out some inferential tests on this as well. So if you're interested, we carried out binomial tests. These were one-tailed tests because we had a hypothesis that essentially the different components of the peer review would be more helpful for learning than not. And so for this, we had to transform the raw data into dichotomous variables. So essentially, we were comparing the number of students who said that they learned little or nothing to those that felt that they learned either something or a great deal, in order therefore to test the null hypothesis. So I've indicated significance with an asterisk and non-significant by NS. So for the reviewing stage, overall it was significant. Students reported learning something or a great deal, more than learning nothing from the process of reviewing other people's work. When it came to self-reviewing, so reviewing their own work after having looked at other people's, again, they found that that contributed to their learning. Receiving reviews also significantly contributed to their learning, but self-reviewing after receiving feedback was non-significant, so it didn't seem to be any more helpful than unhelpful on balance overall, which is interesting, but I'll come back to that point. As well as making comparisons between the different responses that people gave, we were also interested overall were there any particular differences. So to compare if some of these aspects of the peer review were more helpful than others, we carried out Friedman tests. Now the Friedman test gives you an overall of whether there is significant difference just from the p-value, but in order to work out which of these aspects are more helpful than others, we had to carry out post-hocs Wilcoxon tasks, obviously with Bonferroni corrections applied due to the number of comparisons here. These arrows depict this. I was trying to display all this in one graph for you. So reviewing was found to be significantly more helpful than self-reviewing after reviewing, and also more than self-reviewing after receiving feedback. So on the whole, reviewing seems more helpful in any aspect of self-reviewing. Again, I'll come back to that and interpret that in a second. And also this difference here was significant. So students found it more helpful to receive reviews than to self-review after receiving feedback. Okay, so thinking about this, I mean, this is quite interesting. Why is it the case that self-reviewing after receiving feedback is considered not particularly helpful? Presumably that's the purpose of receiving a review, is in order to be able to review your own work. And so I guess our interpretation of this, and hopefully it'll fit with the data that I'm going to present to you afterwards as well, is that it seems that students were at the point of receiving the reviews and reading them already making comparisons to their own work at this point here. And so here in this stage, we were asking people to write down their reflections on their own work. It seems that the actual writing process wasn't particularly helpful, presumably because they'd done all of the processing on their own work at this stage of actually reading the reviews. The other take-home message from this graph is that the two things that seem most helpful were the actual reviewing process and receiving reviews. So in relation to the reviewing process, what we can take away from that is that in asking students to provide a review on someone else's work, it's not just that they're providing a service to someone else. Reviewing other people's work is actually helpful for them. That contributes to their learning, and they learn from that process as well. And also what's interesting about this is that it fits with the, I think Maxine said this earlier on, that there's previous research that demonstrates that actually reviewing other people's work is often as helpful, sometimes more so, than receiving reviews. So again, the benefit to this process isn't just in receiving reviews. Actually giving reviews helps people as well. That's beneficial to people's learning. So let's look at these two things in turn, these two aspects of the peer review process that seem to be most helpful to people. So we'll look first of all at reviewing. What was it about the reviewing process that was considered to be helpful? So which aspects of reviewing contributed to learning? And we identified 5 aspects down here. And so the scale now is blue, contributing little or nothing, purple contributing moderately, and pink contributing a great deal. And so students considered that rating and evaluating 3 different peer reports contributed to their learning. Comparing one peer's work with another peer's work also contributed to their learning significantly. Comparing peers' work with their own work, they found helpful also. Comparing peers' work against the criteria, they found helpful. And writing out feedback comments for peers, they also found helpful. So basically all of the aspects of reviewing that we identified were rated as being helpful for students. But there's a particularly interesting one, which I think will fit with what I said a second ago, and that is that students, it didn't come out as significant in the comparison, but certainly the trend would seem to be that comparing peers' work to their own was the thing that they found most significant here. Now, this was during the reviewing process, the point at which they were asked to review other people's work. So they hadn't been asked at this stage to make an explicit comparison between the other person's work and their own. In fact, this is cohort 1, so they were never asked to make an explicit comparison between the other person's work and their own. But nonetheless, it seems that one of the aspects of the reviewing process that is most helpful to them is just spontaneously making these comparisons of other people's work to their own. So they're learning about how to improve their own work on the basis of reading other people's work, even when they're not actually asked to do that. And again, that fits with what Maxine said earlier on about some of David's work just last year, some of his recent work suggesting that students are spontaneously engaging in comparison of other people's work to their own. So in reading other people's work, they're able to learn about their own work and get some ideas for how to improve that, it seems. So the previous slide showed us that reviewing was helpful. Here we've got different ideas of the aspects of the reviewing process that were considered to be helpful, essentially all of them. In the next slide, we're thinking about what did the students actually learn from this process. So as I said, we know reviewing is helpful, we know which aspects of reviewing are helpful, but what are they actually learning? What is it they're taking away from this? So what was learned from the reviewing process? And this question was a question that was addressed to cohort 2. So as a follow-up to the information that we got from cohort 1. So what were they actually learning from this? So students reported that the reviewing process contributed significantly to knowledge of where their work was strong or weak, ideas to improve their work that they hadn't thought of before, understanding of the assessment criteria, but these two weren't significant, so they didn't feel like the reviewing process contributed particularly to them obtaining different perspectives on the topic under investigation or different perspectives on report writing. So again, just some reflections on this. It's, I guess, not overly surprising that students found that they learned more about the assessment criteria from engaging in the review of other people's work, specifically because they were asked to review other people's work in light of the assessment criteria. So it's not surprising, but still it's a nice result. You'd certainly hope that that would be an outcome from this, that in reviewing other people's work in relation to the criteria, they're learning more about the criteria, and presumably that would prepare them well for becoming more independent learners and being able to assess their own work better in the future. So not surprising, but still good. But again, and it fits with this, hopefully this idea that we're building up. What are the other things that people seem to be learning here is how to improve their own work. So the knowledge of where their work was strong or weak, and ideas to improve their work that they hadn't thought of before. So they're learning about how to improve their own work just from the reviewing process. So cohort 2, if you remember, were asked to explicitly compare their own work to other people's work, but not at this stage. This is still the reviewing process where they're just looking at other people's work and writing comments. But again, the fact that they're identifying that they're learning about their own work from that, again, fits with this bigger idea that students are spontaneously engaging in the review of their own work when they're reading other people's work. And again, that fits with when we explicitly ask people what was learned from comparing their own work to peers. And these aspects were the same, these different things that we could be learning were the same. The two that were significant here were the same two as reached significance previously. So essentially they're learning about their own work when they're explicitly comparing their own work to peers, but they're also learning about their own work before they're asked to explicitly compare the peers' work to their own. They're just spontaneously doing that. And so essentially, in both cases, it seems whether they're asked to compare their own work to peers or not, they're spontaneously doing that and they're learning the same thing from that. Okay, so now we'll change our focus. So now we're thinking about the process of receiving feedback. If you remember from the very first slide that I presented, we were thinking about the two things that were helpful. So one was reviewing other people's work and the other was receiving feedback. So what is it about receiving feedback that students find helpful? So the different aspects down here, getting different perspectives on their work, they found.
Donna, just very quickly, because there's a question in the chat about the stats you are presenting.
Okay.
And so there was a question about if you're saying that something is significant, is this testing if the 3 response categories are equal?
So in relation, can I see the question? But well, I think.
So maybe Lisa, if you want to come on, just ask the question.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. So I was like, if something's non-significant, what is that? Does that mean more students thought it contributed nothing than thought it contributed something, or that all 3 response categories aren't different, significantly different?
Yeah, so we took the raw data and we got a dichotomous variable. So essentially we're collapsing across these 2 categories here and comparing these 2 to this.
Okay,
yeah.
I just missed that, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine, that's fine. Yeah, so if it's not significant, it means that essentially this was pretty similar to these. Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's now clear. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so what was I saying? Yeah, so we're thinking about the process of receiving feedback. So that was also identified initially as being helpful, as well as actually giving the reviews. So when students were asked to think about the different things they could be learning, they thought that the process of receiving feedback contributed to them learning about different perspectives on their work and receiving feedback which they couldn't deduce themselves, but they didn't find it particularly helpful to see how peers wrote feedback comments. And when we carried out Friedman tests on this, then getting different perspectives on their work was the thing that was strongest here. So it was more helpful than the other two. So getting different perspectives on their work was the thing that students identified as being most helpful from the process of receiving feedback. Now we're moving to research question 3. And so we're thinking about how does the quality of the work that's reviewed contribute to perceived learning. So if you remember, students were reviewing an exemplar and which was of good quality, and 2 papers from their peers, which therefore were of variable quality. Might have been good for some and not for others, or a mix for some students. And so what we're interested in was the perception from cohort 1 of how much did the work of different quality facilitate their learning. So we asked them when they were comparing their work against peer work of high quality or a range of work of different quality or against peer work of low quality, which facilitated their learning. So we've got blue here facilitating their learning least, purple facilitating their learning more, and pink facilitating their learning most. And here you can see that students considered it more helpful to compare their own work against peer of high quality, and that was significantly perceived as more helpful than comparing their work against a range or comparing their work against other work of low quality. So again, the star one here, the one that students find most helpful, essentially was comparing their work against peer work of high quality. It's interesting because I think evidence seems to suggest, as we were looking at this, that actually they benefit from comparing the work against anything at all, but it's interesting that they seem to think that this is the most helpful. Okay, and a sneaky extra graph, which is just something we were interested in, is, you know, after the students had gone through this process of peer review, what were their perceptions of it? Were they concerned about anything? And if so, what? So for this one, we asked people, what are the challenges and concerns about peer review from the student perspective? And we addressed this to cohort 1. So blue corresponds to students being not concerned, purple corresponds to them being moderately concerned, and pink corresponds to them being very concerned. These binomial tests were two-tailed because we had no particular predictions about them being any more concerned about some things than others. So yeah, these are two-tailed. So it seems they were concerned about their own ability to produce comments and also the quality of the comments that they received from peers. So overall, they were worried about students' ability to produce comments. They were still concerned about the absence of teacher feedback, which is interesting, even having gone through this whole process of reviewing other people's work and getting feedback, which they seemed to benefit from. Still, it seemed that they just wanted a teacher to tell them what to do here. Also, they seem concerned about going through this whole process and still not being sure actually what good quality work is. Perhaps that's more of a confidence issue than actually them objectively not being able to improve. Notably, they were not at all concerned about sharing their work with other students. So this was significant too, but significant completely the opposite direction. So while they were concerned about all of these things, they were absolutely significantly not concerned about this. And the comparisons just show that essentially this was significantly less of a concern than all of the rest. So I guess for anyone thinking about setting up a peer review task, if nothing else, you can be confident that students seem fairly happy to share their work with other people and not worry too much about that. Okay, and I will now pass back to Maxine.
Oh,
How
you're
much-
still on mute. Let's see.
Okay, thank you. Never learn not to do that, even though I've been on Zoom an awful lot the last year and a half. So just to summarise, because that was a lot of data that we talked through, when we go back to the analysis of the self-review comments, the main things that seem to have come out of this is that the comparative condition where the students compared their work directly with the other students that they just reviewed seemed to generate more processed, higher level comments. Whereas when students were asked to compare their own work with a rubric, it generated more content-specific comments. And that trend seemed to be the same, whether they were looking at or reviewing exemplars, high-quality exemplars, and students' work. Second part was about the contribution of peer review to learning, what students thought it was doing. It seems that reviewing and receiving reviews are both seen helpful, but particularly reviewing. And I guess the thing that came out of some of the graphs that Lorna presented there is that comparison to other students' work seems to be happening spontaneously, even before the students get to that self-review process when they're asked to do that. So that's an interesting point. And then finally, in terms of quality, perhaps unsurprisingly, students felt that reviewing high quality work was most helpful, but they also felt it was still helpful to have a range of work, and that they did have concerns about peer review process. Interesting, they say they were concerned about the quality of their own comments as providing feedback as well as what they receive. And then when we looked at the actual comments themselves, actually they were fairly high quality. So the students were concerned, but actually didn't really have that much basis for concern given the comments that we've analysed. So I'm going to now let David start talk about our conclusions and some other work he's going to share with you.
Okay. Maxine.
Oh, sorry, I've got limitations, but I'm going to skip that because we're behind time.
Okay, Maxine, how much time do we have now?
I think we're a little bit over. Carolina, do you want to?
Yeah, we have probably 10 minutes left.
Well, I think really I should just, I have a few slides, but I think I'll leave them because I think we should really have the questions. I mean, I think you've covered most of the things. I mean, making comparisons against similar work results in self-feedback comments at a high relational level, comparing against the rubric, even if the rubric asks for it, because the questions in the rubric ask them about evidence and argument, but still the comments when they make comparisons against other work. Comparing against other work exemplars results in students generating feedback that goes beyond the assessment criteria because they generate feedback relevant to themselves. And this has also came out in other studies I've done. As Maxine said, the sequence of peer review, itself, generates feedback because the students do something and then they review work that's the same as theirs. So why wouldn't they be thinking about the lens for their own work is the other work? So they start generating ideas about their own work, even if you don't ask them. But I still argue that making this deliberate and saying to the students, compare that against yours has a powerful effect. I mean, we say to students all the time, go and look at that resource. If we say to the students, go and look at that resource and compare it against what you've written, look at that paper on that topic, students will generate better feedback. So making it deliberate is what turns inner feedback into powerful feedback, because students are comparing against all kinds of things all the time, as we all are. And there are many arguments for this in terms of raising students' metacognitive awareness about their own processes, but also giving teachers information about what students are able to generate themselves, so that teachers are not giving students feedback that they can already generate from other means. So we can reduce, this is how you reduce teacher workload. The area that I won't go into right just now is that the instructions for comparison, as we can see from this study, are quite important. And that importance is not just whether they're comparing against another work, but actually the detail of the instructions. So for example, if you give the students have written a dissertation and you say to them, compare that with another dissertation, it's too complex an item. You would have to say to them, can you compare the structure of your dissertation against the structure in those dissertations and tell me how you can improve your structure. So the instructions, I've been working a lot of instructions, but just a highlight of where I'm going with this research, and I won't do the other slides, Maxine, is that we can use this to do anything in feedback. We can help students, for example, develop critical thinking. In psychology and in every other discipline, theory, practice is an important idea. But what if we get students to create some examples of something, and then we give them a theoretical model and say, compare that against the practice examples you've done and tell me how you can improve the practice, or tell me what's wrong with the theoretical model. We can actually use feedback to develop critical thinking in many, many different ways, not through just through peer review, but through resource comparisons preceding peer review. So you get the students, what we're doing in accountancy and finance is the students might solve a complex problem in accounting to do with bad debt. And then the teachers created a video of her talking through her way that she would solve the problem. The students compare what they've done against the video explanation and identify how the teacher thinks it's different for them, or the teacher gives them a flow chart of a model for that kind of problem-solving process and ask the students to compare their work against the flowchart. There are many, many possibilities here, which I won't go into just now, because I think this study is so complex. I mean, one of the things I find with peer review, it's incredibly complex, and there's a lot of comparisons going on that we're not asking students to do. And it's very rich because it also involves dialogue. But I think I won't really say much more here, apart from what I've said, because I think we need to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions. So I won't go further, Maxine.
Thank you so much for your talk and for your input in presenting the data and the concepts behind peer reviewing. We have a couple of questions indeed in the chat. Can I ask maybe first Abu Novera to come on camera and ask their question? I have chatted with Abu before, so.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm Kelly. I had a question. The information is a lot, and so I was just wondering how long did it take to gather everything, like in terms of a time frame?
Thanks, Kelly, for your question. Not actually that long, because I did it within the confines of a course that I was teaching. So across the semester, towards the last maybe 2 or 3 weeks of the course, when they'd done their analysis, we got them to submit their piece of work, the report, to the peer review. So that took about 3 weeks. So a week, to submit, a week to review, a week to get their comments back. So that part actually didn't take that long. There was a bit setting up initially, and obviously going through ethics and setting up the tasks on OPA. But once it was set up, it could run within about 3 weeks. And then the questionnaire aspect we did shortly after that. So again, opened that for a week or two.
Can I add to that, Maxine, briefly? This was a big study, but you can do this in a tutorial or in a lecture session. I mean, you could have the students write an explanation of a concept in psychology or draw a diagram of a model or something, and then you could give them an exemplar and say, compare your work against that and write down how you think it could be improved. And then you could put them in small groups and say, now have a discussion about that. And they would discuss each other's work and discuss the model that you'd given them, whatever you'd given them as an input. And you could ask them to identify any questions you have for the teacher out of that. They'll have generated a huge amount of feedback from comparing against the model, comparing against a discussion with each other, and then they'll only ask you what they can't generate themselves, or they might ask you for reassurance. So it can be done anywhere, this.
Okay, thanks. And I think Abu, I don't know if they're around, or will I just answer the question from the text?
Otherwise, there's a question from Karen in the chat as well.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Karen, do you want to just ask the question here? If not, I can just read out the question as well. That's fine. Is this result due to students preferentially processing self-relevant information because it's self-related? And are they concerned about peer judgments?
Okay, maybe I'll try and answer this one. The first part about they're preferentially processing self-relevant information because it's self-related. It seems that they're doing this almost spontaneously before we ask them to do this and process anything and produce written out self-reviews. So yes, in a way that's true. But I guess we're not too surprised by that. I think often when we look at anything or read anything, watch anything, we often attribute something to ourselves, interpret it through our own lens. The part about being concerned about peer judgments, I don't think was the case. So certainly from what Lorna showed in terms of the concerns about peer review, that wasn't one that came up. Also, we didn't ask them to mark each other or give each other an assessment or a rating at all. This was purely feedback. And I think that there can be issues with the other aspect of peer assessment when they are making judgments, but we didn't ask the students to do that.
Thank you, Maxine. So I'm just going to read out the question by Abu. Based on the graph, and I believe that was one of the first graphs that Lorna showed, I guess that learners learned a great deal after reviewing and receiving reviewing. However, they learned little after self-reviewing in the other two charts. Does that mean lack of evaluative judgment skills?
Yeah,
Lorna, maybe?
yeah. So I think essentially what's going on with that is that students, as soon as they get the chance, are comparing anything that they're reading to their own work. And so they feel it seems like the process of actually writing it down isn't helpful. So that's what we explicitly labelled in the study as self-reviewing. But and this relates to, I'm sure, some of the focus group data from, there was focus group data, we didn't present it today, but from a previous talk that we gave, where essentially they didn't really seem to feel that actually writing their comments down helped them at all, because they'd already done the processing earlier on. So they are absolutely self-reviewing, but they maybe don't feel like actually writing it is helpful. Does that help?
Yeah, I think this statement is, I mean, it's a complicated thing, but it's certainly not true, because the whole process is self-review. I mean, the whole study was about self-review. So to say self-reviewing doesn't have an effect is just not a clear statement. It's either the students feel writing the comments doesn't have effect, as Lorna said, because they've already done the self-review. But they're basically saying the process is helpful, so they're saying self-review. It's terminology issue here that's really important, because, you know, I've done, you know, dozens of studies on this, and having students make comparisons, which is what this is about, because comparison, when you say self-assessment, self-review, evaluation, reflection, there's always a comparator involved, you know, and what you're doing is you're making students make explicit comparisons and with something they've done. It's not about judging themselves, it's about the work they produce some work, they do some work, they make a comparison, they produce an output. In my argument in my paper on this is that they need to do something deliberately. You need to make the deliberate comparison, and it's useful if they make some kind of output, either discuss it with peers, write it down, or update their work with it. And one of the things they were doing in this study was they could update their work, so they could use the stuff. So writing it down might not have seemed as important, but that element about writing it down only came out in cohort 1, not cohort 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was just going to say, what we didn't look at was obviously that this was time bound. So we didn't, I wonder if there'd be a benefit to them writing it down in terms of, you know, remembering for the next assignment what they learned about something, but certainly within the time frame of making changes to that paper, they didn't seem to think it was useful to write it down.
what I can say anyway is that there is a study, I have a published study with Suzanne McCallum in Accountancy and Finance. And basically what we did was the students did 3 reviews like the ones that were done here, one after the other with 1 exemplar. And they wrote down what they learned from each review, in words. And then we independently, we got the teacher to write down what she would write as comments. And we compared what the teacher wrote against what the students wrote. And the students generated better and more elaborate feedback than the teachers. But all students, including the weaker ones, because they went through a cycle of 3 reviews, their comments matched the teacher at different levels. So something like 20% matched the teacher after 1 review. After 2 reviews, 40 or 50% matched the teacher. After 3 reviews, 60 or 80%, I can't remember the numbers, matched the teacher. And after 4 reviews, 94% of them matched the teacher's comments, but just asking them to do it, not to write it down, you wouldn't really know that. So one of the reasons of writing it down is to find out from research. But I think there's something different because they're writing it down, they're generating the feedback and they're thinking about the feedback they generate. But it's very difficult to prove that how you do a comparison, a study that compares a natural process with a deliberate process, because as soon as you try and investigate the natural process, it's no longer a natural process. This is a problem we've been having in Utrecht, where we've been trying to look at this in interprofessional learning. We've been trying to look at how it happens naturally, but as soon as you start to try and collect the data, you've made it deliberate in some way.
All right, we have 2 more questions before we conclude. One is by Phil. Phil, do you want to come up camera and ask the question yourself?
No. Yes. Oh, wrong camera. Sorry. There's a view. So it was just kind of sorry, Zooms. I guess my question is really, well, my question was actually, do you think this would work well with staff where they were improving their own feedback by reading other staff members' feedback to try and generate better feedback? And I guess what's really implied in that is there something about it being students and they're trying to learn something about how to develop a skill, where compared to members of staff who are perhaps more ingrained into their own viewpoint and their own kind of own self-knowledge and self-skill, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I can see what you're thinking, Phil. So yeah, in theory, I think it would be helpful to do that. But I think it'd be harder to persuade staff or anyone that's been working in a certain way for a long, long time to change what they do. Whereas the students are kind of hopefully open to learning new things, of taking new approaches. I wonder whether there would be more resistance or more difficult to do that. But I do think it's a really good idea.
Yes, it's a nice place to start, at least, I would say.
I would say yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but one of the, that kind of, because I didn't do my slides on this, it kind of, my point on this, Phil, is that, there are students, everyone is generating feedback all the time, below conscious awareness. As we do some work, I'm writing my paper, I'm comparing it against other papers. I'm talking to my colleagues, I'm comparing it against that. I'm looking at what my colleagues write. I'm going online and finding some resource, and I'm using that to update what I'm doing. So we're doing it all the time. So I've got a big project in the business school on inner feedback, basically comparisons. And every study I do becomes more interesting. But my current thinking on it is this, that we're talking a lot about teacher comments. Remember, to use teacher comments, students must compare them against their work and generate feedback out of that. So the first thing would be to get students to make explicit what they generate from teacher comments. And that might be revealing to teachers. Then you put peer review into the mix and you say, okay, they get comments from peers, they need to compare them and they can compare against peer work. But these are both dialogical and they both have elements of judgment from peers or for teacher. When you ask students, and what I'm looking at now is resource comparisons, when students compare their work against the resource, and this is underplayed in the whole world, of education on feedback research. When students compare their work, something they've produced, against a disciplinary resource of different kinds of resources, there's all sorts of possibilities. I write a report, I compare it against a video. You know, I write a report, I compare it against a flowchart or a diagram or whatever, you know, so that the possibilities are endless. Now, when you compare your work against a resource, you're making a judgment. It's not making a judgment of you. A resource can't make a judgment. So what you do is you get students to do resource comparisons, then you wrap them in peer comparisons and you end load teacher comments. Teacher comments is the last thing you provide. And what happens when you do this is you see what the students are generating from these other things. In actual fact, the amount that you need to deliver is a lot less. And what you do deliver is targeted to where the students can't, where they have blind spots, you know, and that's how to reduce teacher workload and increase student agency in the feedback process. But, you know, so what you're saying about teachers would work as well. I mean, there's a big study in America where you just ask teachers to go around and watch other teachers teaching, good teachers and bad teachers, and they learn more from that than someone coming in and commenting on their teaching, because that's how we learn, by making comparisons. It's better for students to generate their own feedback and find things out themselves from making resource comparisons than to be told by a teacher, because it's more memorable. And if they see they can do it themselves, then they'll become more confident in their own ability. It is the case always that when you put students through this, that they want reassurance from the teacher. But that's because we haven't been doing this in schools. You know, now I've got a project running in the Netherlands in schools as well on this, because it's just completely under research. It resets the whole agenda. The whole feedback literacy agenda is about helping students make better use of teacher comments, i.e. become more dependent on their teachers. When they're generating feedback all the time anyway, why don't just build a natural capacity? This is looking at feedback from the inside out rather than from the outside in.
Thank you. Hope this answers your question, Phil. Lisa, I saw you have a question here. Can you come on camera and ask the question, please?
Yep, we've run over, so I'll be very quick. I just want to thank you so much. I'm really excited to use this for the formative assessment for my coding class. I'm wondering about like interactions between, like, why does it not seem useful for some students, or is it that students at different levels of mastery might benefit more from assessing really good exemplars or really poor exemplars? So if we only have time for one, what's your, should they review a random other student, especially if the class is extremely varied, or an exemplar?
I would go for a very good exemplar if you had to choose one. Just from my own experience and from what I know from the research, that exemplars are seen as really helpful in terms of eliciting that kind of internal feedback. But in saying that it's not too far away from the standard that they're aiming for. So, you know, if it was a high level sort of academic journal article that was quite difficult to decipher, and that was your exemplar, probably just it wouldn't be useful for them. But if it's a exemplar that's at the level that they are, from very good to excellent, then maybe that's the way to go. But Lorna, David, have you got any comments?
Yeah, I wouldn't use one, because the students will think that's what they've got to produce. Yeah. You know, I would use two contrasting examples. They don't need to be the top quality examples, but I wouldn't ask them necessarily to review these examples. I ask them to compare them against their work and update their work. And actual fact, there are arguments why you should use two. You should give them, I had a protocol, I've done this with a postgraduate course, where the students write a literature review, and I gave them two literature reviews different from theirs in economics, and asked them to compare them with each other and tell me what made them good. And then I said, can you now compare them against your work and tell me how you can improve it? And the students again generated better feedback than they got from the teacher, which she just did as a research thing. But the students at the end, I asked them about this in the end, and the students said, you know, I said, what did you think of all of this? And the students said, I'm surprised no one asked us to do this before. And he wrote a quote that I'm going to put at the top of a paper where he said, had I been doing this since the first year of my university course, I would have developed my own feedback system and I wouldn't have been so reliant on the teacher.
With a course like coding, where they're producing code, but they don't read it very often, except really good examples that I've written. Yeah. There's a lot to learn from trying to read someone's code that is difficult to understand, to realize, oh, I shouldn't do that thing because I don't model doing the bad thing.
Yeah, no, good, bad examples. I mean, poor examples are good. So I do think the range is quite interesting, but there should always be some good examples in, because the very good students will need to be stretched as well.
Yeah, but I definitely, if you're going to give exemplars, I wouldn't even tell students that they're exemplars, because I think then that just creates more dependence on the staff, and it also kind of stifles creativity and makes them think, well, this is how it should be done, and then they won't problem solve in the same way.
Yeah.
But here's, I mean, in terms of coding, Lisa, I mean, one of the things I'm interested in is getting students to create apples and getting them to compare against bananas, you know, because I mean, there's a very good study when I've been looking at this comparison stuff, not a study, but a research by a guy who was looking at bumblebee foraging, you know, in terms of genetic determinism and everything. And he compared the theory of that against Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and generated a completely new theory of bumblebee foraging. And it was a very good example of a dissimilar entity comparison. I'm really into dissimilar entity comparisons, but they could be on the same subject content, you know, because I think we keep thinking of the exemplars, but here's two things about exemplars. The students write an essay in working memory, and you give them other essays on working memory to compare their work against, and the students will, you know, produce better essays on working memory. They'll create feedback on the content and the process. But what if you give them an essay on long-term memory that's well written, and you say, can you improve your essay? But see if you can use the information from about working long-term memory to improve your essay on working memory. This, you know, brings in subject content in a different way. And the third example there would be, you give them an essay on working memory and they compare it against essays on behaviorism, and they'll only focus on how the essays are written. You know, so this is just looking at exemplars in a different way. But if you start looking at dissimilar entity comparisons, it opens up a whole new set of possibilities. People in chemistry can't understand chemistry just by textual explanations. They have to look at equations and diagrams. So if you ask them to look at a conceptual explanation and compare it against an equation, a diagram, a flowchart, or some other representation, it's a different, they see the knowledge in a different way and bringing it together. So you could have students in psychology, right? Some of them write something about working memory and they create a posters. Others write an essay, short essay. Others do a presentation, and then you get them to compare their outputs with each other, you know, and generate feedback from that. Completely transforms the way that we think about the generation of feedback. Exemplars is a it's been very narrowly conceived.
Okay. Yeah, I think those are really good points, particularly when David said that, you know, always provide more than one example, because what you want to do with examples is that they compare them and actually extract the underlying principle that you actually want them to learn, right? So
that's a good thing about examples.
Yeah, I know we're a bit short in time, but I know that Caitlin waited to ask her question. So do you want to come on camera and ask your question, Caitlin?
Hi, I think it might have already been answered, but I just thought it was interesting that students seemed very willing to share their work with other students. It was, although I'm guessing it was anonymous, however, there was still the preference for the teacher to see it in the end, or for the teacher's feedback. But I think what David was saying was it's maybe because the students haven't had experience of doing this before, and therefore, you said you were doing a study at school in the Netherlands at the moment, but maybe that's why they still feel like they want the teacher to say something, whereas you had a student who said he wished he had this sort of process going on, and then he'd be less reliant on the teacher in the long run. So I just thought it was interesting initially that they were more than happy to share their work with other students and to receive the comments, but they still wanted that teach or something, but maybe that's just because that's what they're used to.
The teacher plays a fundamental role in this, though, because the teacher is I mean, the other thing is about informing students about what you're actually doing. The teacher needs to select the comparisons so that when you find, let's say you get the students to produce something and they produce, you know, you've given them something to compare and they produce something and there are still errors in the stuff. You could say, well, okay, I'll go in and I'll then tell them where they're wrong. But you could say, you could select another comparison and say, why don't you focus on this one and compare your work against this? You can kind of you can decide, you know, obviously you need to be sampling the student's work, but instead of staging a commentary, you could stage another comparison and see whether that actually unfolds something, because at the end of the day, the students have got to discover it for themselves, whether you tell them that it's comments or not. The problem with comments is that they're different. That comments are an explanation of what quality is, or, you know, a commentary on what they should be doing. Whereas examples are real things that they can compare against and see how someone else has done it. So they have different qualities. So teachers need to really think, you know, they have a role in selecting the comparators, but you could also say to students, can you tell me some things that you found useful when you were doing this, you compared your work against, that helped you? And then you give them to other students and say, why don't you use that for a comparison? You could increase student agency in a lot of different ways. And instructions can either be closed or open. You can say either, what did you get from making that comparison? Or you can say, can you compare that directly in terms of this analysis that you've done or the evaluation that you've done, and tell me how you would improve from that, so you can focus them or not. So you can change the agency through the instructions, through the selection of the comparators, through anything you want. I mean, the possibilities. I mean, when I started this, I kind of thought it was all a fiction, but I've done lots of studies in the business school. I've got people doing this outside, and it really works. I mean, because we just never really done it. I mean, students do it. We're all doing it all the time, making explicit. But of course, teachers are still really important in this, because maybe the students can't see something at the end, no matter how much you give them. And then you need to come in and say something. But the fact that they've done the heavy feedback workload themselves first means they'll be much more receptive to what you give them. That's what I found with somebody I worked with in New York, who said, I've got this student who just, whatever I say to them, it doesn't really work. But when they did some of this first, they were more receptive to what the teacher was providing.
Okay,
Thank you.
I think we'll have one more question from Helena. All right, make it a quick one, and then we're going to wrap up. But I don't want to just oversee any of or just ignore any of the questions, because I feel that the discussion is really helpful. So Helena, go.
Thanks, Carolina, and thanks. That was a really interesting presentation. I think my thoughts just go back to that discussion you had about students making explicit in their self-reviewing and them reporting that they found that the least useful. However, that is, to me, the process where they're actually making a forward plan. So if they're not enjoying that part, if they're going to avoid that part, how can they actually use this then to improve their work if they don't make some kind of plan about what to do there?
The students didn't say they didn't like it. They just said it was less, they just rated it less helpful than something else. You know?
Yeah, but the problem is, if they don't see it as helpful, then why would they engage in it?
Yeah, it's just that I have a thing about this, because I never found this in any other study that I did on this. You know, that students said that they didn't. I mean, the students in the economics one said writing it out was the most critical thing, because it meant I was kind of making it clear to myself. So I don't really know what was going on in this study. But the other thing is, student perceptions don't always match up with the reality. I mean, in the study with Suzanne, where the students generated better feedback than the teacher through reviewing, when we asked them, what did you find most helpful, reviewing or receiving comments? There was an even split on it. You know, receiving comments from peers, even although when we analysed the receipt of comments from peers in terms of what they wrote, it added very little to the learning at all. I mean, they generated, it was the last thing they did, and it generated hardly anything. but the students said, yeah, it's really, really important that I get these comments.
I think as well, it's how you set up the task, and I suppose, you know, we're using the terminology peer review, you're going to get peer feedback. This is a formative activity, is that their focus is on that as the outcome. And then we did talk about self-review, we explained it all, but I suppose that was kind of in the middle of it, and it was part of the in Europa, you know, it was another question after one of the peer review questions. So I think it's as well as what students' expectations are. Their expectations was to get peer feedback and do peer review. So this other bit, they're like, well, I don't really know because I wasn't expecting to do it. So
yeah, that was the other thing, Helena, that's important in this, that they said that about receiving feedback. So you receive feedback, then you're meant to write down what you learned from receiving it. And you basically write down what the person said to you when they gave it to you. Whereas when you're comparing your work against someone else's work and you're asked to write it down, it's a different process, because you can't write down what someone has said. No one said anything. You know, so on the one case, you're just repeating something that someone says. It doesn't really make much sense. The teacher's given me these comments. What did you learn from it? I learned what the teacher said, so write the same thing down, you know, the peers. Whereas when you're comparing against a real item and you have to write it down, that process is completely different.
Yeah, I think maybe Tracy has a comment on that as well.
I mean, if you don't make it explicit, this doesn't really work. I mean, if you don't, as you said, I mean, if you don't get the students to explicitly do something, and writing it down seems to be more powerful than most other things, but you know, updating their work is another possibility, or discussing it with peers. But if you don't make it explicit, you know, you might as well not, then what are you going to do to make it happen?
I guess though, I mean, it really would require further research, but we don't know that it's not explicit. So maybe that's why they've literally thought about it and thought about it, and so they don't see the additional benefit of writing it down because they already know what their action plan is and what they need to do to improve. So we don't know for sure, but yeah, that would be something to look at. Sorry, Tracy, you've been waiting, I think, have you?
No, it's fine. I have used a bit of formative feedback for presentation exercises with students, and I just wondered, David, if you've conducted several of these types of things, did you find when it's anonymous you get more feedback, or have you been making it personal? Because when I've used it, it has been specifically to people, students.
What you mean more feedback from the peers?
Yes. Do they?
To be honest, you know, what I would do in the first instance with this is I would take that element away. In the Suzanne study, what we did was, in the first study, they reviewed the peers' work and then they reviewed their own work against the peers' work. You know, in the second study, what we did was we took away the first part. We just asked the students, look at the peers' work and tell me how you're going to improve your own. And the students, all, you know, 90% of them participated in this, and they got good results from it, and their grades improved. We actually looked to see what happened when they upgraded their work, and the grades improved, including the poorer ones. About 70% of them, some of them didn't participate, others made improvements, didn't improve their grade. Then we said to the students, how could this be improved? And they said, it would be improved if we could get the feedback from the peers. But they weren't, you know, they didn't give feedback to the peers. So they didn't even write feedback for the peers. They just wrote comments on their own work. You know, so that, I think the starting point is to get them into this idea that it's not about what they write. See, this is why peer review is complex, because if you look at studies on peer review, most of the complaints are students don't think they're getting good comments from peers, or they don't feel they're able to make comments because they don't have the skills. And also it's a kind of judgment. So if you take that element away and just use the best part of this, which is generating your own feedback from comparisons, and then you can put them in groups to discuss what they've learned from the comparisons or whatever, and create the peer process around another way. But you know, there's probably once the students get used to this, you can probably get them, you know, to give better comments, you know, by explaining it all and telling them the value of it and everything. But I'm not really so much interested in that. You know what I mean? That's the skill of writing comments for other people. is a great, might be a good skill. What I'm interested in is how does peer review improve the student's own learning?
Yeah, their own reflex. Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Hi, Maxine.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me thank you again, our speakers today, Maxine, David, and Lorna, for your presentation, for answering questions and commenting on questions and sharing your experiences, your research, and your expertise. Thank you very much. And I hope to see you all next time in February for our next TILE meeting. Thank you.
Bye.